You have more ways to connect than any human in history. But why does it still feel like this?
There is a specific moment that most people recognize, but almost no one talks about. You're in a room full of people. Maybe it's a party. Maybe it's a work meeting. Maybe it's a family dinner you've been to 100 times. And somewhere in the middle of it, between the noise and the movement and the faces you know, something quietly disconnects. You're present, but unreachable. Visible, but unseen. You go home. You tell yourself you're tired, but tiredness doesn't quite cover it. Tiredness is physical. This is something else. Something that sits in the chest rather than the body. A kind of hollow that the evening's company somehow made more noticeable rather than less. That feeling has a name, but most people don't use it because using it feels like an admission, like a verdict about who you are and how well you're managing. Loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone. That version is clean, almost comfortable by comparison. But the loneliness of being surrounded and still unreached. The loneliness of connection that doesn't quite connect. Researchers have been sounding alarms about this for over a decade. Former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023. The numbers they cite are striking. Somewhere between a third and a half of adults in developed nations report meaningful loneliness on a regular basis. The statistics on young people are more alarming still. But statistics don't quite capture what this actually is, what it feels like from the inside, why it persists even when the conditions for its relief seem to be present. That's what this is about. Begin with biology, because it reframes everything that comes after. Loneliness is not a mood. It is not a personality trait. It is not, as it's so often coded, a kind of weakness in people who can't manage their social lives properly. Loneliness is a biological signal, as ancient and as functional as hunger or thirst. It evolved, most likely, because our ancestors who felt acute discomfort when separated from the group were more likely to return to it, and therefore more likely to survive. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo spent decades studying loneliness at the University of Chicago, and what his research revealed was quietly radical. Loneliness, he found, triggers measurable changes in the immune system, in cardiovascular function, in the regulation of cortisol, in sleep architecture. Chronically lonely people heal more slowly. They get sick more often. They die, statistically, younger, with some studies placing the mortality risk of chronic loneliness comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The body treats social disconnection as a threat to survival, because for most of human history, it was. What's important about this framing is what it does to the usual narrative. We tend to think of loneliness as a response to circumstances. You're lonely because you're isolated, and once the isolation is resolved, the loneliness will follow. But Cacioppo's research suggests a more complicated picture. Loneliness alters the way the brain processes social information. Chronically lonely people become hypervigilant to social threat, more likely to perceive ambiguity as hostility, more likely to interpret neutral expressions as rejection, more likely to withdraw preemptively from social situations to avoid the pain of anticipated disconnection. In other words, loneliness, sustained long enough, begins to generate the conditions for its own continuation. It is not simply a response to a situation, it becomes, neurologically.
Now, consider what modern life has done to the social structures that loneliness evolved to push us back toward. For most of human history, people lived in small, stable communities. You were born into a group. You stayed in it. The relationships that constituted your social world were not chosen, they were given. Your neighbors, your extended family, the people you worshiped with, worked with, depended on, these were not people you selected on the basis of compatibility. They were people you were stuck with. And out of that stuckness, over time, real intimacy sometimes grew. This is not nostalgia. Those communities were also sites of conformity, surveillance, exclusion, and cruelty. The person who didn't fit the group's norms paid a real price. The freedom to leave, to choose differently, to move, to reinvent, is a genuine freedom and not a trivial one. But something was also lost in the leaving. And what was lost is harder to name than what was gained, which is partly why it so rarely gets named. The sociologist Robert Putnam documented this in his landmark 2000 book, Bowling Alone. He tracked the collapse across the 20th century of what he called social capital, the dense web of civic organizations, religious communities, neighborhood associations, informal gathering places that had constituted the connective tissue of American social life. Bowling leagues, Rotary clubs, parent-teacher associations, church attendance. The specific forms don't matter much. What matters is the function they served. They put people in sustained, repeated contact with others they hadn't chosen, in shared pursuit of something beyond individual interest. These structures weren't perfect, but they were generative. They produced relationships as a byproduct of showing up over time in the same place. The relationships didn't require initiation or maintenance in the modern sense. They just accumulated. Most of those structures are now gone or dramatically diminished. And what replaced them, the optionality, the mobility, the digital platforms promising connection at scale, has not replicated the function. It has replicated the appearance.
This is the point at which social media enters the analysis. And it's worth being precise about it, because the conversation around social media and loneliness tends to collapse into either techno-pessimism or defensive counter-argument, neither of which is very illuminating. The research is genuinely mixed. Passive consumption of social media, scrolling, observing, comparing, is consistently associated with increased loneliness and decreased well-being. Active communication, direct messaging, small group coordination, maintaining relationships across distance, shows more neutral or even positive associations. The distinction matters because it points to something specific about what social media does and doesn't do. It is extraordinarily good at delivering the signal of social connection, the awareness of what others are doing, a sense of ambient presence in other people's lives. What it is not good at, structurally, is generating the conditions for genuine intimacy. Intimacy requires time. It requires repetition. It requires the experience of being witnessed in mundane, unperformed moments, not just the curated, photographed ones. It requires, perhaps most critically, the experience of being with someone when things are uncomfortable and having both of you stay anyway. Social media optimizes almost perfectly against these requirements. It rewards the curated over the mundane. It makes exit frictionless. One click, one unfollow. One conversation you simply let lapse. It delivers connection in fragments, brief, bright, and discontinuous. None of this is malicious. It's just the nature of the medium. But it means that a person can be, in the modern sense, extremely socially active. Hundreds of followers, daily interactions, and always populated notification feed, and still be deeply, chronically lonely. Because the activity is there, but the conditions for intimacy are not. There is a specific type of loneliness that has no widely used name, and I want to spend a moment with it, because it may be the most common form in contemporary life.
It is the loneliness that arrives not from a lack of people,
but from a lack of being known. You have acquaintances, you have colleagues, you may have a partner, a family, a social life that looks, from outside, entirely adequate. But there is a version of yourself, your actual interior, the texture of what you think about and fear and notice and feel that you have not shared with anyone. Not because you were rejected when you tried, but because the opportunities for that kind of sharing never quite materialized, or the relationships around you never developed the depth that would make it feel safe or appropriate, or because you yourself are not entirely sure what that sharing would even look like. This is what the psychologist Dan McAdams calls the hidden self, the dimension of personal experience that exists below social performance, that doesn't get expressed in ordinary social interaction, and that accumulates over time into a kind of interior pressure. The loneliness of the hidden self is particularly difficult to address because it doesn't look like loneliness from outside. It doesn't look like anything. The person is functional, social, and apparently fine. And they may not even use the word loneliness to describe their experience, because the word implies isolation, and they are not isolated, but they are unreached. And the difference between isolation and unreachedness in terms of lived experience may be smaller than it sounds. Now, here is where the analysis gets uncomfortable. Because if you look honestly at the research on what actually alleviates loneliness, not temporarily, not symptomatically, but genuinely, the answer is not particularly convenient. It is not a social activity. It is not better communication skills. It is not a dating app or a networking event or a digital community of people who share your niche interest. It is sustained, repeated, mutual vulnerability inside a relationship where both people have decided, implicitly or explicitly, to stay. That's an enormously high bar, and it requires something that modern life is not structured to make easy: time, proximity, friction, and the willingness to be known before you know whether being known will be safe. The conditions that generate this kind of connection, living near the same people for years, participating in the same recurring community structures, having relationships that aren't based on compatibility but on shared circumstance, are exactly the conditions that modernity has steadily eroded. We have traded them for autonomy. And for many people, that trade was worth it, or necessary, or both. But it came with a cost that we are only now beginning to fully account for. Here is what I find most worth sitting with. Loneliness is rising fastest in the demographic that, by every external measure, should be the most connected in human history. People in their 20s who have grown up with smartphones, social platforms, dating apps, and the fullest optionality of modern social life report the highest rates of loneliness in most surveys, higher than the elderly, higher than people living alone. This is worth pausing on, because it inverts the intuitive story. We tend to imagine loneliness as a condition of circumstance: the elderly widow, the isolated rural worker, the person physically cut off from others, and that loneliness is real and important. But the epidemic being described in the research is not primarily a loneliness of circumstance. It is a loneliness of structure, a loneliness that persists inside social abundance because the abundance is not producing the thing the nervous system is actually asking for. What the nervous system is asking for is not contact. It is continuity. The experience of being known by the same people, over time, in a relationship that persists through discomfort and change and the ordinary dullness of being alive.
That experience has become genuinely harder to arrange in contemporary life. Not impossible, but harder. It requires deliberate choices that run against the grain of a culture that optimizes for optionality, novelty, and frictionless exit. There's something in evolutionary anthropology called the grandmother hypothesis. It proposes that one reason human females live so far past reproductive age, uniquely among primates, is that grandmothers provided crucial survival benefits to their grandchildren. The sustained, committed presence of experienced caretakers embedded in multi-generational communities increased offspring survival rates significantly enough to select for longer female lifespans. The reason I find this relevant is what it implies about human social architecture. We evolved inside structures of sustained, multi-generational, obligatory communities, not chosen community, given community. The people you would turn to in crisis were not people you'd selected for compatibility. They were people you'd accumulated through the unavoidable facts of birth, geography, and shared survival. Modern life has made almost all of that optional. And the optionality is, in many respects, a profound liberation. But the nervous system that's navigating that optionality was shaped inside a radically different structure. It doesn't know how to find what it needs in a world of choices because it evolved in a world that didn't offer them. The freedom to choose everything means the responsibility to construct everything. And most people, understandably, have not been given any map for that construction. They accumulate contacts and call it community. They accumulate followers and call it connection. And then they wonder, privately, why something still feels missing. I don't want to end this with a prescription. The research doesn't really support a clean one. And the problem is structural enough that individual prescriptions feel somehow beside the point. But I do want to name something that I think gets under-acknowledged in most discussions of this.
The loneliness epidemic is not primarily a technology problem. It is not primarily a social media problem. It is a problem of social architecture, of the fact that the structures that used to generate community as a byproduct of ordinary life have dissolved, and nothing has emerged to replace them with equivalent functional depth. That's a much harder problem than screen time. It doesn't have an app solution. It doesn't have a self-help solution. It has maybe a cultural solution, a gradual relearning of how to build and sustain the kinds of commitments that produce genuine intimacy over time. But cultural change is slow and generational and largely invisible while it's happening. What I find strange and worth noting is how thoroughly the epidemic has been individualized in public discourse. Loneliness is framed as a personal condition requiring personal remedies. Go out more, join something, reach out, be more vulnerable, as if the collective dissolution of community structures is most usefully addressed by individual behavioral change. It's not that individual behavior doesn't matter, it does. The person who cultivates depth over breadth, who shows up repeatedly in the same places with the same people, who resists the frictionless exit, that person is doing something real and meaningful, but they're doing it in a headwind. The loneliness epidemic, at its core, is a document of what happens when the architecture of belonging collapses faster than the human need for it can adapt. The need doesn't go away. It doesn't update to fit the new environment. It remains persistent and biological and very old inside a world that has changed almost beyond recognition in a single generation. And so people find themselves, as perhaps you have found yourself, in the strange modern condition of being surrounded
and still waiting. Connected and still unreached. Busy and still hollow in a way that busyness doesn't fill. That waiting is not a weakness. It's not a failure. It's not something to be fixed with the right productivity system or the right social habit. It's what it feels like to be a social animal in an environment that has not yet figured out how to meet what social animals most fundamentally need. And recognizing that, clearly, without self-judgment, might be the only honest place to start. Thank you for staying with Void Wander until the end of this episode. In a world where everything is competing for your attention, the fact that you chose to sit down and actually listen, to me, that means more than you might think. If this episode left something in your mind, even just a small question, a different angle, then it's done its job. See you in the next episode of Void Wander.